How does a modern country lose a quarter of its economy in just 5 years? Well, Greece's crash out began in 2009 as the global financial crisis exposed deep structural weaknesses in the country's economy. Years of excessive public spending, widespread tax evasion, corruption, and a failure to implement meaningful reforms left Greece extremely vulnerable. Eurozone membership also constrained its ability to respond. Greece couldn't devalue its currency to regain competitiveness on the global market. On top of this, the true extent of national debt was deliberately concealed, with deficits underreported for years. By 2009, Greece's debt to GDP ratio had ballooned to 127%, well above EU limits, and by 2014, it had only increased to 177%. What followed was catastrophic. Between 2008 and 2013, Greece's GDP shrank by 25%, marking one of the worst peacetime recessions ever experienced by a developed economy. Unemployment peaked at 27.5%, with youth unemployment surpassing over 60%. Harsh austerity measures slashed pensions, wages, and public services. Roughly 400,000 people, many of them young and educated, immigrated between 2009 and 2016. In 2015, Greece came close to leaving the EU altogether. A referendum rejected proposed bailout terms, but the government ultimately accepted a third bailout. By the end of the 2010s, the immediate crisis had largely subsided. Yet its effects still linger on to this day. A large demographic shift has occurred due to the many young people leaving for abroad, resulting in a dependency ratio of 38% in the country, which is the fourth highest in Europe. While the economy has slowly recovered, the country's inflation is quite high, and debt remains amongst the highest in Europe, projected to be around 140% of GDP by 2026. Speaking of that region, the Balkans is no stranger to economic mismanagement. Imagine waking up and your paycheck won't even buy a loaf of bread. In 1990s Yugoslavia, that wasn't a glitch, it was daily life. Hyperinflation got so bad, people carried cash in garbage bags and used bills as wallpaper. At its peak, hyperinflation hit 313 million% per month. Salaries were worthless by the time they were cashed. People paid for groceries with stacks of near valueless bills or bartered with cigarettes and flour. One loaf of bread could cost billions of dinars by sunset. This chaos didn't appear overnight. After Tito's death in 1980, Yugoslavia's economy declined sharply. By the late 1980s, foreign debt exceeded 20 billion USD and unemployment hit 17%. Ethnic tensions and a broken federal system also blocked reform. When war broke out in 1991, GDP in some republics fell by over 50%, and Yugoslavia's industrial output plunged 60% by 1993. Western sanctions on the country cut access to global markets. Yugoslavia's central bank resorted to printing more money, triggering one of the worst cases of hyperinflation in history, with prices doubling every 1.4 days in late 1993 and a peak monthly inflation rate of 313 million%. I don't even know how to write this out. By 1993, the economy was in total freefall. The government printed a 500 billion dinar note, and even that couldn't even buy a bus ticket. Inflation wiped out life savings. Public trust completely evaporated in the government, and basic goods became luxuries. Daily life was defined by scarcity and improvisation. A new currency introduced in 1994 finally ended the hyperinflation, but the damage was lasting. The economy of Yugoslavia completely lay in ruins. Millions fell into poverty, with real wages reduced to a fraction of their 1989 levels. Trust in state institutions had more or less collapsed. Many saw the government not as a source of stability, but as the architect of their misery. Corruption flourished, black markets continued to thrive, and resentment simmered. By the late 1990s, Slobodan Milosevic's grip on power weakened under the weight of economic failure, war fatigue, and mass protests. In October 2000, after a disputed election and nationwide demonstrations, he was finally overthrown. But the scars of the crisis, and the mistrust that it bred, remain deeply etched in the region's political and social fabric. Still, it gets even worse. When the Soviet Union collapsed, Russia didn't transition into capitalism, it plunged. The 1990s were a decade of economic freefall. Factories shut down, pensions evaporated, and millions fell into poverty almost overnight. In 1992 alone, prices rose by 2,500%. Entire life savings became worthless. The root causes run pretty deep. After decades of centralized planning, The abrupt shift to a market economy, called shock therapy, was poorly managed. Price controls were lifted, but institutions to manage inflation didn't exist. Corrupt privatization handed state assets to a small elite, birthing the now well-known oligarch class. Meanwhile, wages went unpaid for months, and bartering became common across much of the country. The crisis had hit a breaking point in 1998, when falling oil prices and a mounting debt crisis led to a full-scale financial crash. The ruble collapsed, Russia defaulted on its debt, and banks froze withdrawals. Poverty and unemployment soared. At one point, nearly 40% of the population was living below the poverty line. The trauma of the 90s didn't just shape Russia's economy, it reshaped its politics. Public trust in Western-style democracy cratered, paving the way for a strongman to take over, Vladimir Putin. As bad as Russia was, though, bread never cost 200 billion marks. That was Weimar Germany, where money became worthless overnight. In the early 1920s, Weimar Germany became the face of hyperinflation. An economic collapse so extreme, money became worth less than the paper it was printed on. The seeds of the crisis were planted after World War I. Saddled with crushing reparations under the Treaty of Versailles, Germany struggled to pay. The German government, in response, just printed more money. When French and Belgian troops occupied the Ruhr in 1923 to force payment as well, Germany responded with a general strike and printed even more money to pay the striking workers. What followed was absolute economic chaos. The mark lost all of its value. At one point, prices were doubling every few days. People used wheelbarrows of cash to buy groceries. Life savings had vanished. Middle-class Germans were completely wiped out, and the elderly who depended on fixed pensions fell into poverty overnight. Though a brief recovery came with the Dawes Plan in 1924, the damage was lasting. Economic trauma eroded faith in democracy and fueled extremism. A decade later, with the Great Depression hitting hard and unemployment soaring, millions turned to Adolf Hitler, who promised stability and revenge. While things were awful in Germany, the true worst economic crash out in Europe is actually relatively unknown, and it was actually Hungary immediately after World War II. By 1946, Hungary was in economic freefall. The country lay in ruins. Factories were destroyed, infrastructure was wrecked, and the economy was burdened by massive war reparations, especially to the Soviet Union. The central bank began printing money to cover deficits, but with no production base to back it, inflation exploded. Soon, prices were doubling every 15 hours. The currency, the pengo, collapsed so completely that people paid for goods with wheelbarrows of cash if they could afford anything at all. At its peak, inflation hit 41.9 quadrillion % per month. I actually really don't know how to write that. The government printed a banknote worth 100 quintillion pengo, which is, I googled this, 1 followed by 20 zeros. It was functionally worthless. Entire life savings vanished overnight. Wages were completely meaningless. The economy stopped functioning. The collapse helped pave the way for Soviet dominance as well. In the chaos, the Hungarian Communist Party gained influence by promising stability, something people desperately craved. By 1949, Hungary had become a Stalinist satellite state, locked strongly behind the Iron Curtain. Eventually, the pengo was replaced by the forint, but the trauma lingered. Hungary's post-war hyperinflation remains the worst in recorded history, even worse than Zimbabwe or Weimar Germany.